This is Lama Tantrapa. Welcome to the Secrets of Qigong Masters, the talk show brought to you by Academy of Qi Dao, the first and only school in the world offering professional education in Tai Chi and Qigong coaching. To find out about the programs offered by Academy of Qi Dao and to learn how you too can become a certified Tai Chi or Qigong coach, please go to qigongcoaching.com. This show is also brought to you by Mastery Magazine, sponsoring the Summit of Qigong Masters that brings you top experts in Qigong in North America. To enjoy watching video interviews with them, please go to qigongmasters.com. Today, I'm honored to be interviewed by my student and colleague, Craig Patey, who has many decades of experience in both energy arts as well as martial arts. Thank you so much, Craig, for being my co-host today.
My pleasure. Thank you. And I'm sure I don't have to introduce Lama Tantrapa, who has interviewed hundreds of Qigong masters by now. Lama Tantrapa is somebody who I found very intriguing as with my background of martial arts, hard style and internal martial arts, and meditation practices in Qigong over decades. I found out about Lama in the Portland area and decided I had to look him up and begin to work with him. So as you know, Lama is the founder of the Academy of Qi Dao, as well as the founder of Qigong Coaching. And so today we're here specifically to talk a little bit more about Tantra, which is implicit in your name, Tantrapa. And I like to call this little get-together everything you ever wanted to know about tantric sex but didn't have a Lama to ask. And everybody, you know, this is probably everybody's favorite topic, maybe after Qigong, I don't know, maybe I go either way, it's a good topic. And so since I have some background with Taoist sexual practices, or what some would call sexual kung fu, I'm intrigued by Lama's approach, and hence we have this the initiative for this conversation.
Thank you, Craig. This is really a fun conversation to have. And so I hope that it's going to be more of a dialogue rather than a monologue. And in our case, we both have a fair amount of exposure to a variety of different approaches, both on the Chinese and Taoist side of things, such as Taoist alchemy, sexual energetics as it applies to working with the energies in the dual cultivation, or so-called the cloud and the rain practices, and also Tantric side of things, both of Chinese and Indian side of the continent. So obviously I've been studying both of them, and also the Tibetan practices, and geographically Tibet is right smack between China and India, so its culture and practices were influenced by both the Chinese and Indian traditions.
I'm interested to know, really to contrast, to compare Tantra to Taoist sexual practices. However, I think perhaps it may be useful to answer a question which I had initially, which is, well, what is Tantra really? I mean, we hear a lot about Tantra in the popular culture, and it's often simply equated directly with sex. But I think perhaps you can illuminate us in the fact that it's actually quite a bit more than that.
Well, it is definitely a lot more than that. I would say that Tantra, as a spiritual discipline, developed in India almost as a counterbalancing force that was balancing the more conservative and, I would say, more patriarchal culture and tradition of Hinduism and Brahmanism in particular. Similar to Chinese Taoism, which I would say also, in a sense, served as a counterbalance for a more patriarchal Confucianist line of thinking. And so both of these traditions have a lot in common in terms of being connected to the energy and focused on energetic development, rather than just doing certain spiritual techniques that are all mental. They're also less rigid and patriarchal, or I would even say hierarchical, in terms of the path the person takes there are certain steps that you have to follow if you follow Tantra or if you follow Taoism, but these steps are less linear, and sometimes they are dependent on your personal development rather than fulfilling certain obligations or performing certain rituals and rites of passage. And what happens in the exploration of Tantra, as many people experience who've gone through this exploration, is that if you come from Western culture or even any culture where sexuality is suppressed to some extent, China is very sexually suppressed culture. So go figure. There is Taoist tradition that comes from China, but by and large, the mainstream Chinese culture is extremely suppressed and sexually ignorant. And what happens is that when a person from any type of background like that discovers that there is a spiritual path that embraces sexual energies rather than tries to control them, suppress them, or just sweep them under the rug, it becomes really exciting to learn about that. And so a lot of Westerners as well as other practitioners of Tantra went really gaga when they thought, wow, this is so cool, let's discover that. And so all their attention went onto this relatively small fraction of Tantric tradition, which is dedicated to sexual practices. And of course, sex sells. So if you write books about Tantra, you're much more likely to sell a lot of books. If you focus your emphasis on sexual practices and some other exciting and somewhat exotic aspects of Tantra as compared to focusing on something more mundane but also much more quintessential in Tantra, such as meditation practices or just learning about energies. So I don't want to overemphasize the sexual components of Tantric practices, but also want to make sure that they are covered in our dialogue, because we can't really sweep them under the rug and consider ourselves Tantric practitioners.
Right. So let me bring you back to the beginning, to the question really. As I mentioned, Tantra is associated with sexual practice in general in the popular view. So can you just quickly define for me, what does Tantra mean?
Well, Tantra literally can translate from Sanskrit into English as a shuttle, basically like space shuttle, a means to cross certain boundaries or certain thresholds.
Or a vehicle, perhaps.
Or a vehicle that allows you to travel from one place to another. It probably pertains to a metaphor of crossing the river that is often used both in Hinduism and in Buddhism, where you basically transition or transcend from one side of the river where there is suffering, and according to Buddhism, there is plenty of suffering happening in the world, to the other side of the river associated with nirvana, or a state of freedom from suffering. And so there are different means to get from the world of suffering, or samsara, to nirvana, or freedom from suffering. And one of these means, one of these vehicles, is Tantra. The word Tantrayana is used when it's applied specifically to Tibetan Buddhism. So Tibetan Buddhism often is referred to as Tantrayana or Tantric Buddhism because it uses the Tantric methods, unlike most other styles of Buddhism that don't really use Tantric methods. Most of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism use what they call the right hand path of Tantra, which doesn't really engage in explicit sexual practices, mostly uses metaphorically or energetically or through visualization, as opposed to the left hand, the path of Tantra, which is more prevalent in India, Nepal, and also exists in some sects of Tibetan Buddhism. Nyingma, for example, is one of those sects that I'm most familiar with, and also I've been practicing and studying Tibetan Bon, that includes some sexual practices and also does use visualization and energy practices in solo rather than dual cultivation.
And this term, right hand versus left hand, has been absorbed into Taoist teaching. I think it has appeared also in Western esoteric teaching. It is actually commonly encountered. And apparently, just like dexter versus sinister in the Latin, there are also these type of connotations in cultures as well, saying that the right-hand path is the righteous path, the left-hand path is the evil path, and
sinister or somehow less respectable.
Yes, so there is a lot of moral attachments to cultures where sexuality is repressed and where its natural expression is repressed. So it can be a difficult topic to approach, and many people separate out spirituality and sexuality and don't think that they're perhaps mutually exclusive. So this is why I find the Taoist sexual practice and by extension the Tibetan Tantric practice to be so important to being in a body and accepting the aspects that come along with that. And I know the Taoists like to have the approach of, well, whatever it is a human is doing, let's use that, let's cultivate with it.
As long as it's natural, it's beautiful. So what we do is we learn how to recognize the natural tendencies or natural flow of things and capitalize on this flow, thereby being in the flow. If we try to use some contrived approaches, techniques, or mechanistic formula, it often leads to becoming less natural. So instead of Wu Wei, using Chinese terminology, it becomes Yu Wei, something artificial, which usually is not as healthy, because what can be healthier than being natural?
Right.
And so, given that, I would like to jump right into the exploration of what it means to study not only Tantra but also Tantric Qigong, which may be even closer to the hearts of our listeners because they're obviously Qigong enthusiasts as ourselves, and also it gives us immediate and direct access to understanding energy dynamics within personal relationships, intimate relationships, or any type of interconnections between people. I would also say that in the long run, the objective of Tantric studies, and by extension Tantric Qigong, is to experience both spiritual enlightenment and union with the universe through mutually empowering and enlightening relationships. And by mutually empowering and enlightening relationships, I mean relationships that can be intimate, but they also can be not intimate. So that's one of the reasons why I make sure that we don't only focus on sexual experiences, because non-intimate relationships can and should become mutually empowering and enlightening, ideally, in our lives. Any relationship can become mutually empowering and enlightening if we are at this level of consciousness where we facilitate this quality of relationships wherever we go.
Like you said, to use the translation, any relationship can be a vehicle.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned being natural and following the energy where it flows, and having studied martial arts and Qigong of various forms over time, and having then been exposed to a Qi Dao approach to natural movement and experiencing the flow without trying to constrain it into a box of a form, I imagine that Tantric practice is a similar approach. I must say that the Taoist practices I have learned start off on a very mechanical level. Especially for males, it becomes important to learn how to control that fiery energy so that it doesn't run out of control and you run out of fuel to work with, to be to use flowery language. But I found that this can lead to an unnatural approach, even though one is trying to go towards a natural play with the energy of yourself and your partner. When one is stuck in the world of techniques, or what I like to call training wheels, you can go in the opposite direction and to complete artificialness, and this can be very disturbing for your partner, for yourself, and in the end, not very satisfying.
Well, I would say that you cannot achieve harmonious goals by disharmonious means. You cannot go towards naturalness by taking unnatural steps. So what happens is that we learn how to identify what is helpful, what is it that promotes our values, and what are our values. If we understand our values, then it's a lot easier to promote them. It's easy to manifest a dream if you know what the dream is. If you don't know what the dream is, no wonder it's hard for people to manifest their dreams, because they're just not familiar with their dreams. So we begin to understand that the primary objective is to experience enlightenment. How can we facilitate mutually empowering and enlightening relationships in our lives? Well, let's take, for example, the most close relationship that we often experience, that is between partners in a family, or a boyfriend and girlfriend, or any type of partnership. If they provide each other with a sense of empowerment, if they facilitate each other's enlightenment, they are on the right track. If they don't, well, then there is room for improvement. There's always room for improvement. We just need to recognize that where exactly is something lacking. So we start looking at where is it that we could improve upon our relationships. Is it in sexual interactions, or maybe it's in our communication style, or maybe it is in the way that one person has so many buttons, wherever you push them, the buttons get pushed, and they create a drama, or they go ballistic. Or perhaps there is an issue with violence, or substance abuse, or addiction of any other sort, addiction to buying stuff, or addiction to watching soap opera, whatever the addiction may be. And so we develop understanding that there are certain things that we do in our lives that contribute to greater harmony, to greater empowerment and enlightenment. And then if we do more of those things, we get more of those results. If you do things that don't lead to those results, and you expect those results to happen, well, that's a sign of insanity. So we learn how to become more sane, how to do things that actually bring forth the results that we're looking for. So starting with result in mind, we essentially reverse engineer our steps. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does, yeah.
So, for example, if we're talking about sexual energetics, if one person is really mechanistic and is following certain formula, and the other person doesn't understand why he's doing this, there's going to be some miscommunication, misunderstanding, mistrust, and perhaps breakdown of this relationship altogether. As a matter of fact, one of my clients shared the story how she had a boyfriend, just started having a relationship, and his boyfriend was doing some bizarre things when they were trying to have sex. He would go through some motions of foreplay, and then he would withdraw, and he would be like, oh, I need to meditate, I need to chant, I need to do this and this, and he would do his motions and his formula, and she would like totally lose interest in the meanwhile. And then he would come back and he would be like, all right, here I am, honey. And she would be like, okay, well, let's start all over. And so they would really have a hard time with that because he wasn't communicating what the heck he was doing. She was not on the same page.
Oh.
There was a major disconnect. Well, creating this communication style that would allow people to even understand what they're doing and then journey together, following a certain path together, is a major component of any type of tantric relationship or any type of sexual relationship or intimate relationship that works. And so we first need to understand that if there is a discrepancy between a level of preparedness of one partner versus the other, well, there need to be a lot of work done to help the person who is not as prepared to become more prepared. There are certain practices that facilitate preparation. There are certain mental attitudes that also lead to becoming more open-minded and more available. There's also a number of physical body awareness that leads to greater preparedness. Having gone through those steps will make this experience a lot more fulfilling, a lot more enlightening for both parties, and also for the person who is providing some help to the partner. It's not that he or she is just wasting time trying to get the person up to speed. No, there is an expression of love and passion and appreciation that will only nurture the quality of a relationship. So it's not like one person can do tantric sexual practices and the other one is just being used for that. Yeah. Which is something that in Taoism happens once in a while, or perhaps on a consistent basis. I hear stories about 90-year-old Taoist masters having practices associated with energy exchange with virgins, and somehow that is considered a wonderful thing. Well, it may be a wonderful thing on one hand, but if it is not mutually empowering and enlightening, there is definitely lots of room for improvement there.
Yeah, that's not the partnership model of Taoist practice that I'm more familiar with. That is a familiar pattern of people who perceive that they have a limited access to source Qi, and that they can gain that by drawing from others. I think that's actually a corrupt view. If you're just out for seeking power, you're definitely you're missing out on many layers of the human experience. And however, that's not to say that this energy dynamic doesn't exist, but it actually leads me into one of the questions that I have that are ongoing, which is about the cultural background of both Taoist arts and the Hindu arts as it applies to the sexual relationship, because all these cultures traditionally are patriarchal cultures, and they have certain cultural constructs when it comes to talking about sexual practices that reflect that patriarchal approach, the male dominant approach. I think there are some schools of Taoist practice that I've encountered, or maybe they're modern relanguaging of these practices that reflect a more balanced perspective. But and I think that ultimately this being a spiritual practice, both partners are going to be spiritual beings, and therefore they are balanced. They are on equal footing at that level, no matter what. So I think that in Tantra, if your ultimate goal is enlightenment, I think it's going to be for sure a big step for both people to recognize that they should be on equal footing energetically, and when you can have that equal footing, then you can facilitate communication, and then one partner won't be seeking to pull from another partner, but both partners will be seeking to lift the other up.
Well, and this is where the study of tantric energetics also has to merge to some extent with understanding of Mahayana Buddhist tradition, where there is the notion of bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is a spiritual being who is ready to experience enlightenment. However, bodhisattva recognizes that if he or she or it is surrounded with other beings that are not enlightened, then what does that mean? Enlightenment in this particular context can be considered a form of awakening, but awakening not in a dream at night or awakening from the dream, but rather awakening within the big dream that we call our daily life. Well, if you are surrounded with dream characters who are not awake or are thoroughly asleep, what does that tell you about your dreaming consciousness that is dreaming this dream up? It means there are many aspects of this consciousness that are still not awake. Therefore, you can't really become fully awake if you surround yourself with people or other characters who are asleep. So what do? Well, we can facilitate their awakening. We can work also with our own consciousness within, so to speak, enlightening those aspects of our own dreaming mind, or dream being, as I put it, responsible for dreaming them up, but also working with the characters directly and facilitating their awakening by both providing the role model of awakening and also providing them with some steps that would help them become more awake, and reflecting back to them that they become more awake so that it would have even more cumulative effect. So that essentially plays out perfectly in this type of relationships in Tantra, where if there are two people involved, this is like a microcosm in which one cannot become fully enlightened if the other one is asleep. So what do? We facilitate mutual enlightenment. How do we do that? By reflecting back to each other certain aspects of their consciousness that are not fully awake, so that they would be able to work on those aspects, bring the light of consciousness to them, enlighten those aspects, and then they would be able to do the same thing for us. So that creates that mutuality that we're talking about.
That's right. And everyone has blind spots. There are aspects of our personality that are not conscious to us, and that is something I've been more and more aware of lately. That's my job in partnership, to say, hey, I see this. I'm not sure if you're seeing that, and I get plenty of that back, reflected back to myself as well. So, and that's valuable as long as we can learn to accept what is.
And that's exactly the practice. We learn how to accept what is, and we also have certain dream of becoming more awake. And it's not that it's black and white. You're either awake or you're asleep. The enlightenment is the process of becoming more enlightened. There are certain steps that facilitate greater awakening. It doesn't mean that you're not going to fall asleep again, but you can awaken sooner again, or for a longer period of time, or to deeper depth. And also, it doesn't mean that we will not have any room for improvement once we become awake. You become awake to the fact that there is a lot more to work on. So that basically creates an ongoing process of enlightenment. We are on the journey of enlightenment, not on the journey to enlightenment. And if we consider that this is the process that happens between two individuals, then they can facilitate each other's enlightenment by doing exactly what you said, pointing at certain buttons, certain areas of weakness, whether it's a physical weakness, emotional weakness, energetic weakness, and saying, hey, what's up with that? How are you going to deal with this area of your being that is underpowered or not quite awake? There is no judgment there is no criticism, there is no poking the buttons to hurt the other, but rather an invitation to bring attention. And where attention goes, energy flows. That facilitates empowerment of those areas of weakness that no longer become buttons. They basically are strong areas that if somebody tries to push them next time, it's not going to create drama or pain or suffering.
Yes, excellent. Yeah. So this is, to me, we're talking a bit about partnership. We're talking a bit about the process of enlightenment overall. I'm interested in drilling down a little bit into some details because
Sure.
my background with Taoist sexual Kung Fu is there were a tremendous amount of details, and there are a lot of physical aspects of the practice that one goes into in order to be more, to use Buddhist terms, to have more skillful means to proceed. So I'm interested perhaps in some of those skillful means that Tantra brings to the fore when exploring working with a partner.
Mm-hmm.
What are the beginning steps? For example, in Taoist practice, I was taught that it's important to have a certain level of mastery over your emotional being, and to have that sorted out, as it were, before one seeks to share that with another. One should have a certain requisite of harmony. Mm-hmm. So, is there a similar approach for Tantra, for partner work?
Yes, there are certain preliminary practices, and these preliminary practices often are done solo. There are some practices that also are done with a partner. I usually introduce the study of Tantric Qigong at the advanced level of Qi Dao studies. So the person has gone through pretty much a year, or at least 9 months, of Qi Dao practices, which provide a thorough preparation for exploration of Tantric Qigong. And the preliminary practices that build to that level usually consist of several things. Developing energy awareness. We learn how to become more centered, more rooted, more grounded. We develop greater sense of balance within ourselves, and recognize that if there is imbalance that is associated with struggling against the flow of qi. Let me explain. Imbalance usually manifests somatically in some form of muscular tension that is usually chronic and unconscious. What kind of tension that is? It can fall under several categories of holding patterns, but it may be a tension associated, for example, with pride or being self-important. Sometimes even can be perceived as arrogant, or it can be depressed or low self-esteem and perhaps sad, or perhaps it can be somewhat skeptical, or maybe even cynical, or maybe aggressive or pushy. So what happens is that any of these stereotypical holding patterns are somatic manifestations of certain habitual states of consciousness that the person has identified with. So they consider this is who I am. They often forget about them being much more than what they think they are. If the person created a certain sense of identity that is relatively limited, associated with only this small number of habitual states of consciousness, it creates the pattern of tension in the body that both reveals what states these are and also allows us to work with them. What we do is we first start with understanding the energy dynamics, where the person, for example, is struggling against the flow, moving them in a certain direction, and they freeze, or that's basically how you stop yourself from moving where the flow is taking it. How do you stop yourself from moving? By tensing up. If you do this on a consistent basis, it becomes a chronic pattern of tension. That's why I refer to tension as frozen movement. Now, if you unfreeze or thaw out this movement, it begins to flow again. You will have less tension, you will have less energy blockages in your body, you will become more available to life, and also have greater range of motion, greater flexibility, that also reveals greater mental mobility and flexibility. What that also means is that you're no longer struggling against the flow, so you're more in the flow. What does it feel like to be more in the flow? Well, not only do you feel less tense and more available to flow freely, you also feel a greater sense of wellness and well-being. So that creates the foundation for further practices. The further practices may lead to understanding how different holding patterns are associated with different energy centers in the body that also process energies associated with those emotions that energy centers process. If they process these emotions in an imbalanced way, for example, one energy center is used all the time and others are underutilized or perhaps not used at all, then it creates imbalance. If, for example, a person uses only 3 energy centers, well, obviously it's a little bit more than one, but still only half of the available energy centers that we have within our physical bodies. And we can talk about even greater number of chakras if we want to, but 6 are the ones that are most prevalent in terms of obvious holding patterns and obvious states of consciousness and obvious locations within the physical body. And so what we do is then we begin to understand how working with these energy centers, so-called chakras, again, that's the example of Hindu influence on the Tibetan Tantric Qigong practices. We work with these energy centers, developing greater balance between them. That also means we learn how to balance our emotional states. So we're not just stuck in one particular pattern, for example, in depression or in aggression or in self-importance or being judgmental or whatever. But we develop ability to switch from one state to another state relatively smoothly and fluidly. We also learn how to shift from one state to another state going through what we call a neutral state. Just like shifting gears in the car with a manual transmission. You go from the first gear to the second gear through a neutral gear. What does it mean? It means that you actually get into this state of equanimity, or physically it manifests as equipoise, being essentially free of tensions. And the more we switch from one energy center to another, going through neutral, or from one holding pattern to another, going through the neutral state of equanimity, the more we get used to being in that state. Eventually it becomes the new normal. It becomes our baseline state to which we revert to every time we're done using a particular energy necessary under the circumstances. When we develop that level of equanimity and equipoise in our physical body, that also tells us that energetically we are pretty balanced between different energy centers or chakras. That also means that we have few, if any, buttons to push. We also create less drama in our lives. We are much more responsive rather than reactive to any stressors or any circumstances that life throws our way. We also develop greater understanding of other people, because regardless which state of consciousness another person is in, we can tap into that energy of consciousness, operate on the same frequency, so to speak, being able to communicate on the same page. Then we can also switch to other energies and other states of consciousness, but at least we know how to be on the same page. We can see things from the same perspective, which creates greater rapport in a relationship. We have greater chemistry. We are capable of relating to people in a much more harmonious way. And when we have this level of harmonious relationship, that is what is necessary to step into the next level of tantric practice, working with a partner. So far it makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so there is no mumbo jumbo. There is no mechanistic approach in terms of, oh, you have to do this formula so many times a day. It's understanding what is going on with you in this particular moment in your life, and how this may be a pattern in your life, so that you can begin to unravel this pattern and see what you can replace it with that would be more functional. When you are in the more harmonious state of consciousness, a more relaxed way in your physical body, you have greater sense of harmony in your movement, which is what I refer to as developing harmonious culture of movement, which is only possible when you're in a harmonious state of consciousness. But then you use this harmonious culture of movement to facilitate that harmonious state of consciousness that would be a more consistent way of being for you. Then you simply start working with another person who is also operating at the same or similar level. So we basically begin working with a partner when we feel like we're capable, we are confident, and at the same time not arrogant or not pushy. We may have a sound judgment, but we're not judgmental. We're responsive rather than reactive. And we are also comfortable with ourselves and accepting the way we are. So we are not just constantly freaked out about being inadequate. And from that point of view, from that level of development, then we can step into working with another person who's at that same or similar level, working with them on creating more harmonious and mutually empowering and enlightening relationships. So having done the practice with ourselves, then we have certain practices that we can do with the other. In terms of mechanistic techniques, yeah, I can throw in a few techniques if you want.
Yeah, well, I understand that you outlined the prerequisites very well, and I think that even outside the practice of Qi Dao, Taoism, or Buddhism, I think those characteristics you detailed were those things which any person should look for in a partner. Somebody who has that kind of confidence, that equipoise, the harmony. First, they are self-empowered. They're not seeking out to be completed by somebody else. Rather, they have promoted their own cultivation to the point where they can share that with someone else, rather than from a needy place. And nobody wants to be in a relationship with somebody who's in a needy, dysfunctional kind of way.
Taking energy all the time, seeking attention, for example.
So, although it is a bit of a high bar for those who are practicing, they arrive at a very good place from which to create a relationship.
Yes, and the high bar is something that is important to maintain, because if we lower the bar to the point that, oh, you don't have to really do some preliminary practices, you don't really have to learn anything about meditation, you don't really need to develop any energy awareness, just do tantric practices. Well, that's exactly what we've been observing in the West. Essentially, there are plenty of tantric teachers, or people who call themselves teachers of Tantra, who just simply offer the sexual practices without any preliminary studies required. That may be filling their workshops and making them a few $1 million in the process. But it does not really lead to an enlightenment possible when we are looking at a consistent and logical process of personal development and mutual development. So we don't want to skip the steps, because if you skip a few steps, you venture further, and then you realize, wow, those fundamental steps are missing. You have to come back and actually take them. That basically creates a back and forth kind of movement along your path instead of a consistent, ongoing journey.
Right. Well, that leads to another question, which, having given the overall background of the steps that one would take to get to the level of considering partner practice or tantric sexual practice, I had prepared some questions, and one of them that sort of seems to fit here, but maybe you've already answered to a certain extent. Is well, what's the simple and doable starting point, simple and doable practices for people to engage in partner practice for mutual empowerment, in light of the fact that you've already outlined quite a bit of the Qi Dao basics.
Mm-hmm. Well, so for example, if you've never studied Qi Dao with me, and at this point you would have to study with me if you live in America or anywhere in the Western countries, that journey could begin with simply developing awareness of pauses between words that you hear. Awareness of pauses between, for example, the barking of the dog in the background or the song of a bird singing in the tree. When we focus our attention only on the peak experiences or the peak of the sound waves, we get a certain bit of information. We get certain experience of that peak. But what happens between the peaks? There are valleys that we pay no attention to, oftentimes completely disregard or not notice. if we learn how to develop attention to the degree that it allows us to notice what's going on between the words, reading between the lines, as it were, listening to the music where you're not only paying attention to the notes, but also to the pauses between the notes. Obviously, there is no rhythm if there is no pause between the notes or beats. We learn how to develop physical awareness of our body. For example, through movement practices. Let's say walking meditation. Most people, when they practice walking meditation, they only pay attention to the moment when the foot lands on the ground. We call it a step. And then another step, and another step. They may have certain technique associated with how to step. They may also pay attention to the way they hold their bodies as they're stepping. But how the foot travels from one place on the ground to another place on the ground is often missed. If we pay attention to the journey of the foot from one place on the ground, the point A, to the other place on the ground, point B, we start paying attention to the movement rather than the landing. We start paying attention to what we call kinesthesia, to develop awareness of movement, kinesthetic awareness. Without movement, there is no life. If we don't pay attention to movement, we're not experiencing life firsthand. We're experiencing life secondhand. What do I mean by that? If you experience life not through kinesthetic awareness, but through some other senses, for example, hearing or sight or smell or what have you, it is a secondhand experience. You are literally watching life. You are listening to life. You may be even smelling life, but you're not experiencing life within your own body, which is the temple that you live in. What we learn is how to develop the awareness of our physical body, how it moves, and the flow of life force within. Once we develop the awareness of movement in our body, then we can notice some minute changes that happens that are associated with more subtle energy currents. Without those energy currents, without paying attention to those energy currents, we won't know how the life force flows through our bodies. There is no way to develop energy awareness. So just this little technique, developing the method of walking meditation where you're paying attention to the movement of the foot through the air in between the landing points, is one of the simplest and most elegant. Well, first it may not feel elegant. You may be losing balance, or you may be feeling like you're doing some jerky movement, or some isolated parts of the body are moving regardless of movement of other parts of the body. So there is some room for improvement.
Yeah, it can feel strange because apparently we're conditioned to focus on those punctuation points, where the foot falls. And as this is something you shared with me relatively recently, I have been paying some attention to it, and it's fascinating, the change in your consciousness, just making that shift. It's really profound.
And then we start learning how to observe things around us and notice not only the objects around us. You know, for example, a teacup, a teapot, another teacup. We also start noticing the spaces between the objects. How the objects relate to each other has to do with their spatial location, which means there are somewhere in space that surround with space. That's not an element in and of itself, unlike what sometimes people think when they hear of the space as being considered as one of the 5 elements in Tibetan tradition. Well, it's not really an element, it's the container for all the elements. If we start paying attention to this container, we start paying attention to the fundamental principle of existence. Then we also realize that paying attention to space allows us to notice that it's not empty. It's filled with something. There is some relationship between the objects of our perception. When we start paying attention to space between us, we start noticing that there is also some energy between us. That's how we develop understanding and awareness of energy exchange between us rather than just doing some formulaic techniques. How do we pay attention to this energy will determine what we do with it. So, for example, if one person feels there is some disconnect, well, then it's time to reconnect, perhaps, or perhaps understand why the disconnect is happening. If there is a clash of two energies colliding with each other, well, let's observe what's going on, why they're colliding, and what can be done about it. If we, for example, feel that somebody is building a wall, stonewalling the other, well, let's see how that's working out for them, and is there any alternative to that? In the advanced Qi Dao level of studies, we learn about another energy center that is not in the physical body. It's actually like a bubble surrounding our physical body from all sides. Not always equally on one side versus the other side. It depends on our holding patterns and whether or not we struggle against the flow of energy within our bubble and around it. If we observe what this bubble is made of, we realize that it's made of a certain energy of consciousness. And this energy of consciousness often creates a layer that essentially serves as a shield, protecting us from what is outside of the bubble. The reason why we build this walls of the bubble is because we essentially learn not to trust the universe, or we learn to be afraid of it, that there are some uncanny forces lurking around and they're going to hurt us. Maybe we've been hurt, or maybe we just grew up as children observing adults who were very protective, or they were just simply carrying around substantial luggage because this bubble is pretty heavy. Essentially, that's what we call karma. The thicker the walls of the bubble, the heavier karmic luggage we haul around. If we understand that karma is not good or bad, no matter how good your karma is, it still weighs you down. The best thing about it is that it can be released. Or simply that we can learn how to open the windows within the walls of the bubble, which allow us to perceive things through fewer filters of perception. Because these walls of the bubble also create major filtering that distorts our perception or deludes us as to what we perceive. And then, of course, we consider that's what is out there. So we confuse the map from territory, as Krzyzewski would put. And then we often relate to other people in the way that we think they are instead of the way they are. And also we try to portray ourselves the way we think we are supposed to be instead of the way we are, which both contributes to greater buildup of the stuff on the walls of the bubble and make them even heavier, and also creates greater discord because essentially we are perceiving things in an erroneous or illusory way. That's essentially what Buddhism refers to when it says that the way we perceive the world is illusory. This illusory nature of our perception can be augmented or improved upon by learning how to open the windows and the walls of the bubble, maybe little portholes at least, and peek through them so that we can perceive things with fewer filters of perception. Maybe not completely ridding ourselves of this karma, but at least thinning the walls or making some portion of the wall more permeable. When we perceive things through the windows instead of the thick wall, we perceive things with greater clarity, and we also experience flow of energy. That flow of energy is what allows us to be more in the flow. If we don't feel afraid of this energy, we don't shut the window, then we can actually connect with another person through this window. Shutting of the window is what basically is caused by fear, and we often experience momentary openings of the windows. For example, falling in love. Love can open the windows pretty widely, but then we often get hurt, or we just create a certain scenario in our minds how we may get hurt. And so we shut the windows. Instead of shutting the windows, we learn how to address our fears, relinquish them, and perceive things clearly through the windows, not only observing the world around us, but we can also observe another person, connecting from heart to heart, or from one inner essence to the other inner essence. If that other person is available and opens their window towards us too. So it's like two soap bubbles with one window opening up and the other window opening up. I jokingly call it like the two space stations docking.
So if I hear you right, some of the first steps would include being aware of the space between, and through that one begins to learn how to perceive things with less filtering, how to perceive what is and what is between us, and the flow of energy and its characteristics between us. And when you can really perceive what's actually going on, then things can be shifted, and the walls, as you say, or the windows can be opened up, because you have experienced that what actually is going on, and therefore can shift that. Without understanding what's really going on, one can't really change anything.
And the funny thing is that changing implies that we don't fully accept what is.
Right.
So, yes, changing is going to happen. Change is the most constant thing in the universe. If we allow that constant process of change to unfold naturally and spontaneously, then it will facilitate that manifestation of that which is natural for us. If we, on the other hand, develop certain idea how change should go, we develop certain intention instead of attention, which is based on acceptance. We develop an intention. This is how I want it to be. Often it's based on an acceptance or lack of acceptance of what is, trying to run away from what is to go towards what we want. And how often do we really know what we would benefit from? We assume that what we want is the right thing. But often what is right for us today may not be right tomorrow. If we base our assumptions of what is right on past experiences or knowledge, often it will lead us astray. And even if we recognize what is right for us and we start moving towards that, it still often means that we are pushing away from what is happening in the present time, not fully accepting it or negating it, and essentially committing violence against it. So what we do instead is we learn to integrate that which we perceive as our dream with the current state of affairs. So we don't polarize them. Or if they got polarized in our consciousness somehow, we learn to integrate them again. There is a certain practice. It's actually a part of a basic Qi Dao meditation course. There is a practice called harmonizing polarities. I refer to it as dynamic meditation practice. That is dedicated specifically to this. How to integrate our current state of affairs with our dream state. And when we integrate the current state and the dream state, what happens? We are in the dream. We are actually living our dream. There's no separation anymore between the current way of being and the dream way. Well, welcome to Nirvana, because you are living in a dream now. This is literally the clear and very simple method of learning how to live your dreams.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure, Ronald.
Thank you, Craig. It's a great pleasure to be interviewed by you. You've been enjoying the interview with yours truly, Lama Tantrapa, on the Secrets of Qigong Masters, the talk show brought to you by Academy of Qi Dao, the first and only school in the world offering professional education in Tai Chi and Qigong coaching. To find out more about the programs offered by Academy of Qi Dao, please visit qigongcoaching.com. This show is also brought to you by Mastery Magazine, bringing under one roof some of the top experts in Qigong in North America for the Summit of Qigong Masters. To enjoy watching the video interviews with them, please go to qigongmasters.com.